Welcome to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Key TV in Eureka, California. I'm your host, James Falk. Before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Productions like this are made possible through the support of viewers and listeners like you. Our guest today, author and thinker Keith Thompson, has been an integral part of the UFO/NHI conversation for decades, and he has worked with a long list of luminaries in this and related fields, from John Mack and Laurence Rockefeller to Stanislav Grof and many others. His roots in the topic are deep, as is his thinking. His most recent book, just recently released, The UFO Paradox, deconstructs the subject from labels on down, winding through its complicated history while also exposing many of the errors and fallacies that have led so many folks down fruitless paths and into unjustified certainties. He also, more importantly, points to what are likely more fruitful paths of analysis. This book is important, and it broadens the UFO conversation to include interdimensionality, folklore, religious experience, consciousness, extraordinary abilities, philosophy, depth psychology, and more. His book is a synthesis of threads that have long come up in the subject, but have rarely been presented in such an effective way. Like one of my previous guests, religious studies professor Jeffrey Kripal, Thompson argues that humanity and its many capabilities need to be a central part of this conversation. Whether the visitors joyriding in the saucers or balls of light represent us from the future, or our souls out for a weekend jaunt, or something else entirely, the phenomenon somehow represents us, even if it's merely a reflection of the questions we're asking. I am absolutely thrilled to have him on the show. This is an opportunity to learn some things. Welcome.
James, great to be here. Let's get going. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation as well. I read your book. I loved it. Took a lot of notes. I have them here. One of the things that we'll start off with to sort of frame the conversation is that you've had some extraordinary experiences yourself, and those, I think, helped you develop the insights and get involved in the conversation. If you don't mind sort of, relating to the audience what those experiences were and how they perhaps opened you up to being able to consider the phenomenon as something other than, make-believe.
Good, I'd be glad to. And it was an important decision for me, a momentous decision in working on this book to decide whether or not I would bring in my own experiences. Because I was writing about anomalous phenomena that is at the margins of society and tends to lack credibility, I realized, looking back on my first book, Angels and Aliens, a couple of decades ago, I unknowingly, unconsciously decided I need to keep myself out of the book. Any first-person experience might show bias that I'm a believer or an advocate or a proponent. As this sort of a set of really literal assumptions I had taken on without knowing that to be an objective writer, I should never use the first-person pronoun. I recall that it was Henry David Thoreau who said, I would not talk about myself nearly so much if there was anybody else I knew quite as well. Now, I went to the opposite extreme. I said, well, in order to talk about UFOs, I really needed to use just the third person. So in this book, there was a shift. I'm older now. I've kind of lived more of my own life. My life experience is somehow more transparent to me. And I thought, especially by writing about the difficulties witnesses have in the UFO field, coming forward and describing their experience to disbelief and scoffing and the debunker impulse in the human psyche. So I decided to write about a couple of experiences. The first was at a person, and I mean personal experiences. I also had experiences tracking this as a young journalist, going back to a sixth grade classroom report about UFOs, so we could talk about that. That would be in the objective realm. But
sure, yeah, but all those, though, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, but about 2 years after that, I had an experience that I could just relate as simply as this. We had a television antenna that was built into the ground next to our house. In the old days, TV antennas were structures that existed either on top of the roof or they were like ladders going up to along the side of the house. We had one of those. I used to climb up the TV antenna when my parents weren't home because it was definitely against the rules. We had a tall house, three floors, 3 stories, and I would go to the top of the roof and find a place. And my purpose in being there was not to be dangerous, but it was simply to lay back and be quiet. Like the song, Up on the Roof. When this whole world starts getting you down and people are much too much for you to take, go up on the roof. Now, one day I went up on the roof. I was 14 years old and I lay back And I simply looked at a beautiful blue sky, probably was summertime, with no purpose, no aim, just simply opened my eyes to the sky. And I was suddenly aware that I was everywhere at once and no place in particular. Everywhere and actually no place at the same time. It was as if the line between my sense of myself and the rest of the universe had disappeared. And yet there was still a strong sense of I. I am here. And in some sense, I am everything. It was a kind of brilliance surrounded me and seemed to lift me beyond time and space. Now, that's how I would say it now. At the time, I was just simply in this moment. And I was aware that I just knew. I said, I'm seeing what really is, be like behind the curtain. I'm seeing more of what always is. And other people can see this. This is what really this game is about. Where we live on this game board of life is a presentation we make as separate selves, all navigating this. This is the space in which all that unfolds. I I realized intuitively this is what people talk about when they speak of God, spirit, soul. It was like center court. I was on center court, and I emphasized the God part because I was from a family that was nominally religious at best. We went to church because it was good for good people to be seen at church. It was a social phenomenon. I had no real indoctrination or even introduction to religious teachings. I didn't even make it through confirmation in my Episcopal faith. We just went to church every now and then. So I came down from that rooftop that day. I didn't go inside and say to my parents who weren't there, but when they came back, I didn't say, "Guess what happened today, Mom? The line between me and the rest of the universe disappeared, and this is the way it really is." This is, I didn't do that. Yeah. I kept it to myself. And yet always had this knowledge. My father would occasionally, I have three brothers, and my father would often look at me and say, "What are you smiling about? What are you laughing about?" And it's because I was always had a sense of that there are two realms in which we're inhabiting. And I was always sort of in touch with this secret sense of things. And I found out the reason I knew it was not something I alone had experienced. It wasn't just some momentary altered state of consciousness, to use that term. It's because I ended up sort of beginning a spiritual search. That is the realm to which I turned. I discovered the writings of Alan Watts and read the varieties of religious experience by William James. I'm in many ways surprised I didn't become a student of Jeffrey Kripal in religious studies. No regrets, but I very much admire his take on these phenomena. So that was a fundamental experience for me. And I'll name one other, but I won't go into as much detail. But over a decade later, when I was in my mid-20s, while body surfing off the coast of Hawaii with friends, with a lot of signs posted on the beach, "If in doubt, don't go out," because of the severity of waves, including the riptides, I went in and did some body surfing, as I had done before in other areas, Florida and so forth. I'd never experienced riptides of this kind, was taken out and had to put it simply, I had a near-death experience. It was before, however, the near-death experience was known to me or to the culture. I'm old enough that to say that Raymond Moody's famous book, Life After Life, had been written and it had begun to stir attention. I think it might have already become a bestseller, but I was in my mid-20s. I wasn't interested in having a near-death experience. I was interested in having near-life experiences. I wanted to get to the center.
You just run a marathon yourself, right?
That's actually a good detail. I had come to Hawaii, and I had the day before with my friends. We'd all trained for a marathon. I completed a marathon, 26.2 miles, and there was something about finishing a marathon that even 24 hours later, there's a sense of invincibility, that you had accomplished something of epic dimensions of the kind that Joseph Campbell writes about in The Hero's Journey, which I had not yet discovered as a book. So yeah, I went to the beach and I saw the signs, "If in doubt, don't go out," but that didn't apply to me. I was strong. I was invincible. "I am large. I contain multitudes," as Whitman put it. So I went out and the ocean said, "Bring us your best, Keith. Bring us your best." And I got carried out very fast and was convinced that I had died. I said, "This is death." I saw my body in the water. I saw my body right there. The sense of I was in place, but it wasn't in the body. And that person, I said, that's Keith. Then I saw my friends on the shore shouting to Keith. And I just sensed the disjuncture, that this is not the way I thought it was set up. I had just gone from struggling as fiercely as I could to survive as that body mind composite, the body mind unit called Keith. Suddenly, I was, in a sense, no longer, my identity was no longer limited to that body. And I remember having the phrase I, the sense of an I, while looking at that body. I said, oh, dead isn't dead. And I went to a place. I will not go to depth on it, but I went through the stages of the near-death phenomenon, the sense of a tunnel, the sense of wisdom sort of downloading, a sense of seeing beyond the boundaries of anything I had ever considered. And the key point for me came when I heard my friend, one of my friends, dear friend Mary Payne, on the shore talking to one of us who'd come to Hawaii. And she was speaking in a tone about as loud as this, saying, why didn't he listen? Why did Keith go out there? I told him it was too dangerous. I heard that from, not from the body. And by the way, if I was listening from the body was 100 or 200 yards out in a very loud ocean with waves crashing. And I was tumbling down in and through all of it. I don't know how I survived. But I went to Mary, if you will. I sort of, from everywhere, I said, Mary, I'm fine. Don't worry. It's okay. You're fine. This is okay. And I'll be seeing you.
Yeah.
So when I somehow managed to come back from this, found myself, I didn't have that classic moment that many NDE people talk about, which is the sense of, this is not your time. You must go back. No, I don't want to go back. I didn't have that. I was just suddenly back in my body, looking through these eyes again. I was aware that I was Keith again, back in the body. So Keith struggling to avoid dying, struggling to hold on to being a separate self, suddenly being released from it and seeming to have the identity of the entire cosmos with no divisions. And then once again, being poured back into this sense of body. It has influenced my lifetime in the sense that I now realize there's a kind of psychic mobility we all have. Out-of-body experiences happen routinely or regularly, not necessarily for everyone, but the in and out of body thing is part of the psyche's capacity to move in and through form. In any case, I survived. I came up on the shore. My friends were seeing how worn and torn I was. I had some scrapes and bruises. The first thing I asked, it was a very lucid moment. By the way, I came up into this cove and there were two dolphins surrounding me. It was right out of central casting.
Yeah.
And so I climbed up on the shore and my friends came and grabbed me. It was like Tom Hanks in that movie, Outcast or whatever it was called.
Castaway. Yeah.
Yeah, Castaway. So anyway, I said, did you guys see all that? And by all that, it meant all the sort of larger perspective, including the sense of a kind of place where I saw and interacted with my deceased relatives, not knowing that that was ever a possibility. I didn't have a lot of imagery of heaven because I wasn't raised in a religious background. I wasn't convinced that something like heaven was the end of life. And so I said, did you guys see all that? And they said, what? And I said, no, you didn't.
You obviously didn't.
So it's like if you remember the 60s, you weren't there. Well, it's the same kind of thing. If you have to ask you if you just saw all of this. So then one of my friends said, man, we really thought you had given it up out there, meaning that you died. And I actually thought that was the opening. Oh, finally somebody will be able to understand that. They said, I did die. And I came back and I looked, and again, I had a very lucid sense of being present. And I looked at their faces and I knew that they were looking at me like I was delirious. And they even said, you've been through a trauma and you're kind of free associating and you get some help and you'll be normal again, which they didn't say that directly. They didn't know about the near-death experience either. And so I learned to live again with a sense of doubleness. And one part of me lived in the normal world of everyday life as a separate self. And another part of me understood that the experience on the rooftop and also the experience of that day in the waters off of Hawaii were the same sort of opening to something larger. So I write about the UFO phenomenon as a call from the cosmos to open our maps of reality. And got my own call. I've had my own calling, and that sense of having a calling. It's not anything grandiose. I often say those experiences I had were not an achievement or an accomplishment of maximizing my personal potential. It was an entirely other, there was no sense of achieving anything. It was a sense of being present as the veils that separate us from seeing what really is just momentarily disappeared. And you see a sense, the strong intuitive senses, this is actually the ground of our being. This is truly who we are. And how we normally appear in the world is like a low resolution version of that, to use a video or a visual. It's like a low resolution, something sent through a modem, right?
Yeah,
Now,
56K.
yeah, exactly. Well, this is a little higher resolution sense. So that disparity is not really a disparity, it's a both andness. So anyway, that's those are the two primary orienting personal experiences that I had. And then I can maybe tell the other one. When I was 12 years old, my most objective experience of this phenomenon as an unintentional or unknowing young reporter came when it was my turn to give a current events report in my a sixth grade class. And I chose a UFO sighting that is going on in nearby Michigan. I was raised in Northwest Ohio. So I covered a particular sighting that went on for 4 days involving lights and craft. And the Air Force investigator became famous in UFO circles. And I got to know J. Allen Hynek had been brought in as an astronomer from Ohio State University. The Air Force sent him to Michigan to deal with all the commotion. He didn't know it, but the Air Force hoped that Hynek would simply explain all this away. He would use his Air Force, his astronomy background to say these people mean well, but they're simply misidentifying natural phenomena. In some cases, they're hoaxes and so forth. So I had I had an imprint that day based on something Hynek said while he was in Michigan. He did a tour of the area, talked to many people about the various sightings, and there was one near the edge of town involving a swamp, a marsh area. There is a phenomenon called swamp gas, where decomposing natural material interacts with the environment and sends out luminous phenomena. So swamp gas tends to create swamp lights, and they're legendary. So at the news conference, he was asked to explain the entirety of what had happened in Michigan. And he said, I can simply say I don't have a full picture, but there is one part of the town, the one sighting over there near the swamp. He qualified it very well. He said it could have been, might have been, I'm not entirely certain, but that one could have been swamp gas.
Yeah.
As soon as he let those words out of his mouth, James, he was mortified to watch the reporters jump up out of their seats, go out to the payphones, call their news bureaus and say, Hynek explains it all as swamp gas. Well, I told about this to my sixth grade class. And it came time to take questions, and one of the students said, well, Keith, do you think it's extraterrestrial? Are they aliens? Are these aliens coming to visit? And I said, I was kind of perplexed by the question, like I would be expected to know that. I said, well, I don't know, but that's one of the interpretations. It's one of the main interpretations. If it's not these other things, it could be aliens. And somebody else raised their hand and said, well, what do you think they saw? And again, I said, I don't know.
Yeah.
But that was not a punt. It wasn't me avoiding the subject. I didn't know what they saw, but I added quickly, I said, it certainly does not sound like swamp gas. What the people reported doesn't sound like swamp gas, explains it very well. I'll never forget my teacher, Mrs. Lowry, came forward and stood by me, and she might even have put her hand on my shoulder. And she said, what I think Keith is saying to us is that it's important with phenomena like this to keep an open mind and ask relevant questions. I had not had an experience to that date of really being affirmed in quite the way that that experience was affirming. It was like a benediction, almost a blessing. Here was an adult, my teacher, who I thought of as a very kind and thoughtful person, who was treating me, this 12-year-old, like an aspiring adult who was making his way in, and he had something to say. I felt seen and I felt heard. And I carried that with me. And she also then said, she, as sometimes teachers will do, they'll turn to you and they use your full name. Mr. Thompson, that was quite a good report. You have the makings of a scientist or a journalist, or maybe even a detective. And then she said, follow the evidence wherever it leads. And there was a kind of murmur in the class. And again, I felt really affirmed in that phrase, follow the evidence wherever it leads. Though I didn't decide on that day in some mythological sense, I am going to explain the UFO phenomenon. No, I didn't even think I would continue. I didn't consider myself a UFO investigator. But what I took away instead was a sense that any experience that could be understood and observed could be subject to empirical investigation. You could be an empiricist, which meant anything was fair game to be observed, that could be observed, could be included in phenomena and could be, investigated and could be interpreted eventually. So at that day, I realized I'm an empiricist. And I continued to track the UFO phenomenon. It wasn't the sole focus of my work as a journalist, but I've come to write 2 books. And so the combination of my objective experience as a journalist, young journalist in the 6th grade, and then both of my personal, larger, numinous experiences have slowly helped me realize that the juxtaposition of those 2 levels, subjective and objective, is very much what the phenomenon does. The phenomenon straddles the very division between the objective and the subjective, the outer and the inner, the mental and the physical. So that's a major part of my hypothesis. This is a phenomenon that promiscuously refuses to abide by the Western distinction, the Cartesian distinction between inner and outer. And that's pretty much where I approach. That's my point of entry.
So it's fascinating to me that at such a young age you were exposed to the various elements that really, for me, vivify the whole phenomenon. Whether it's report about the sightings in Michigan, and that later went on to lead to congressional hearings. It was actually a national conversation that arose out of that. I mean, Gerald Ford was involved in, I think, setting up the hearings that followed that, and it was a big deal. And then later on, you had your cosmic awareness moment on the antenna, and then the near-death experience. Now, I'm thinking that after sometime later than your mid-20s or whatever, you cemented your career as a journalist. So what led you back into UFOs or that kind of topic after, as you got older and became a professional, writer and journalist? What did you feel or fear any risk that you might face in terms of ontologically, like putting people off, or how did you feel about getting back into it and why?
Well, a couple of things about my experiences in both cases, the TV antenna up on the roof and the near-death experience. I knew that the main pushback I was getting, or would get from either of those, would be from people who didn't understand. I didn't doubt that I had had direct experiences of reality as something larger. And so I now realize I simply said, well, that is something that is part of reality. I experienced something as part of reality. I favor a kind of empiricism that is not limited just to the 5 senses, that we can be empirical about visionary states as well. I know that mainstream empiricism of the materialist kind has no use for that. They don't want to make that the main issue we don't discuss in Western scientific procedures is consciousness. What do we do with the fact that consciousness appears to be part of the picture? So I never had any sense that well, I knew that it was important to be careful about who I talked to about my own experiences, but it wasn't because I feared that I'd had some aberrant experiences. As a matter of fact, I don't know. I intuitively, when I found out about the near-death experience afterwards, when I found out about the phenomenology of the near-death experience, it was sense of, my Lord. So there's a phenomenon I didn't have descriptions of. That was the sense of going through the tunnel. That was the experience of not just reviewing my life, but that profound experience of reliving my entire life in a matter of moments, that kind of direct downloading of so much information that I came back with. I made a point when I found out about the near-death experience. I also found out about the skeptics, the debunkers, who'd written books explaining that the near-death experience is a kind of brain program, a end-of-life transition program to ease the fear and go into entirely explainable in terms of neuron function of the brain. And yet there are too many aspects that cannot be explained. In other words, I don't know that my encounter with what seemed like heaven and my deceased relatives amounts to a direct experience of, quote, the afterlife. But I think it is entirely consistent with that. And I also, there was a piece of it that can't be easily explained, and that was the sense of having overheard my friend Mary. By the
Yeah.
way, I didn't finish the thought. That after I survived, and the next day, after I was sort of really recovering from the initial trauma, I said to my friend Mary, "Could we go for a walk? Would you go for a walk with me?" She goes, "Sure." She kind of knew that I was the person of the day, and she said, "What's up?" And I said, "I heard what you said on the beach yesterday." She said, "What are you referring to? What do you mean?" I said, "You said, why didn't he listen? Why did Keith go out there? I told him it was too dangerous." She was also in her 20s, a couple of years older than me. And she looked at me and I could see the blood draining from her face. She was just, we both understood. Neither of us in our 20s had given any, deep attention to what is the nature of consciousness. The idea was when you're aware, consciousness is on, and then when you're asleep or when you die, it's off. We didn't, yeah, you don't think those things through until, well, I began to think them through, and she actually began to be a thinker about these things too. So we both knew that that I'd had an experience of something that shouldn't have been possible. And we had many conversations over many years about life and death and how the fear of death is probably the ultimate fear because the fear that we will cease to exist. Is there anything more profound than I will not exist after death? And country music tells us, "I won't exist if you leave me, honey." Well, that's a downloaded version. That's a contemporary of I need this relationship or I won't exist. I need this job or I won't exist. Those are subsets of the larger issue that I won't will I continue to exist? Does consciousness survive? And Mary and I had many conversations all the way through. So that's a long answer to your question.
I love it. That's brilliant. And at what point? I mean, you had these two different, experiences. One as a fledgling reporter in sixth grade, and then these consciousness experiences. At what point did you begin to link the two? Was there an epiphany that you had, or did you know from the get-go that somehow what you had experienced in the ocean and on the antenna were related to UFOs, or what brought that to you?
Well, I knew first, I should say that after having had the near-death experience, I became interested in spiritual things. I
Sure.
took up meditation. I read Alan Watts and his many fine books, other spiritual traditions. I was drawn to Vipassana meditation, the Buddhist type meditation. I never became a
Yeah.
Buddhist. There's a lot of Buddhism that makes psychological sense to me, but I never became a Buddhist. I've always had a kind of sense. I've always been drawn to the language of Jeffrey Kripal wrote a book in which I think in the subtitle is The Religion of No Religion. There's a kind of, in fact, Frederick Spielberg, Spiegelberg, a magnificent professor of religious studies and philosophy at Stanford, came up with the phrase atheism in the name of God. Atheism in the name of God, that is the God, the God beyond religion. Atheism in the sense that you wouldn't fully believe in the mythologies of any religion fully. You might join a religion, you might find it useful, you might find it true to be a Christian or a Buddhist or Hindu. But he said he became an apostle for the idea of you wouldn't believe any of them, but they are all attempts to approximate a deeper mystery. That always rang true for me. So when did I understand? Maybe I always understood that it somehow was. I've come to think that actually my interest in the UFO phenomenon was a way that I had sort of gave myself permission to explore into a parallel mystery that I had no skin in the game. I had no dog in the UFO fight. I wasn't
Yeah.
committed to defending a UFO experience of my own or really
Yeah.
defended much of anything. So I think that my movement through the UFO terrain over the years, such that a lot of people have not even known since my book is out. A lot of people say, "I've never heard of Keith Thompson, but who is he? Where did he come from?" It's funny, I never joined the rituals of what is called ufology, UFO research, but here I am. I'm a guy who's been tracking it from a sort of a distance, and now I've landed with it. But I think to answer your question directly, in the process of writing this most recent book, I began to realize the price that witnesses in the UFO field have, especially close encounter witnesses like Calvin Parker in Pascagoula, Mississippi.
Which you write about. Yeah.
Yeah, at the young
Yeah.
students in Zimbabwe, Africa, at the Ariel School, their inability to complete the experience, to come back into society whole. I said, that is what I experienced in the immediate aftermath when my friends on the beach looked at me like, you are saying things that a madman says. You say you died and came back. There's this beautiful line from the German poet Goethe that goes like this: tell a wise person or else keep silent, because the masses will mock it right away.
Yeah.
Tell other wise people things about wisdom. Tell secrets to people who also know what those secrets are. Find people who know those things. Have conversations with them. Don't tell the public at large because they will mock it right away. So I came to understand there was a kind of disparity. I learned not to talk casually at cocktail parties or potluck parties
Yeah.
about dying casually, about life and death. It doesn't generally go well.
Yeah.
You need to be very context aware to have these larger conversations. So I have come to in the process of writing this book, I reached a decision. I had a conversation with my sort of larger field of with my unconscious or whatever. I can't say I was walking around the house openly talking or hearing voices, but I said, should I bring into this book, even though it's not related to the UFO phenomenon, should I bring in my own anomalous experiences? And the answer was a kind of resonance that said, do you want it to be true? Do you want to write a true book?
Yeah.
I said, thank you. That's all I need. So I
Yeah.
began to write about this. And in the process, I actually found myself returning both to the rooftop experience and to the near-death experience, and it's realizing that it continues to download. If you use that phrase, download like a file on the desktop, you
Yeah.
download a really big file and you have to walk away for a while, go get some coffee because it's going to take a long time for that file, depending on how much memory you've got, to use computer metaphors. It's taken some long. These experiences continue to download, and they do so with a sense of remembering who I really am, remembering what the game is really about. So it's a combination of I'm a scientist and I'm also a mystic, I guess you could say. And
Yeah.
I wear those two identities as part of the larger cloth of my wardrobe, I guess you could say.
It's interesting to me that you kind of in the book it's revealed that you're sort of a Forrest Gump of the UFO phenomenon in that you were at some seminal moments and with seminal people like important thinkers and you had an effect on them. I mean, whether it's Laurence Rockefeller or in particular John Mack. I mean, these people are giants in our field and they really shaped our thinking, and I think they set a bar also for the sophistication that we should all aspire to in terms of how we grok it and try to figure out a path forward. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with John Mack and also your involvement in the Rockefeller initiative of the 90s when you guys were trying to basically lobby the Clinton administration to be more open with the UFO stuff?
Be happy to. I got to know John Mack as a result of both of us sort of arriving at this marvelous educational institute called Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, which was founded in 1962 to explore these kind of larger questions, the larger mission of science, the larger mission of religion. What are the further reaches of human potential? Well, I developed an association with Esalen and its work. I became familiar with a friend of Dr. Stanislav Grof and his wife
Yes.
Christina, and got to know them both well. And so did John Mack. John Mack also crossed paths with Dr. Grof. Stan Grof still is recognized as the leading experimental researcher in this phenomenon of psychedelics. He
And
did.
he mapped, in some ways, he mapped consciousness, right? Like he found that there's a transpersonal level that he equates with spirituality, and he did it with holotropic breathing and also with psychedelics, right?
He was part of the recognition. Abraham Maslow was part of it. There were other early philosophers who said, wait a minute, the Freudian model is not the full model. The Freudian model of the unconscious explains parts of the phenomenon, but it's very much from a materialistic frame. Freud thought of the unconscious as merely the repository of things that the ego level doesn't want to deal with, so it pushes things away. So the unconscious is a repository of unwelcome thoughts, embarrassing thoughts, and also simply forgotten thoughts. We let go of things and they end up in the unconscious and they surface at various times in life, like when you remember someone you haven't. But Jung went much further. He said, no, that's only the personal unconscious. There's also this phenomenon of the collective unconscious, which is a much vaster creative matrix that is similar to what the esoteric traditions call the Akashic records. The Akasha is all knowledge, all intelligence, all wisdom is contained and present right now. So Groff found his way into that research as a mainstream psychiatric researcher, studying studying this new drug that had been released. It was not only not yet forbidden, it wasn't illegal, it was considered a new tool. So he had a psychedelic experience with LSD of his own and began to administer it in psychiatric settings, began to realize that this gives access to what he and others called the transpersonal, a larger realm that connects with Jung's thinking on the collective unconscious, and that our nature, in addition to being defined by the Freudian model of sexual urges and violent impulses, is also about our deepest longing is to actualize further potentials that we don't know we have. So Stanislav Grof got to know John Mack. John Mack, Harvard psychiatrist, raised as an atheist by his traditional parents, and went through the training as a psychiatrist, materialist training, and extraordinary work, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of a biography of Lawrence of Arabia. He found his way into this material through holotropic breath work, which is a technique that Stan and Christina Grof developed to access these fuller aspects of our nature, expanded states of consciousness without depending on psychedelics.
Yeah.
And so it was so John Mack began to do this holotropic breath work and began to have an experience that, wow, my Freudian training, my materialist training did not introduce me to the full picture. So being the investigator that he was, he began to look into all sorts of phenomena that start to show up when you sort of take the blinders off. And in some sense, like me, he found his way into the UFO phenomenon. So there was a day that Stan Grof said to John, this is a talk that a friend of mine, Keith Thompson, gave at a conference on UFOs. John cocked his head because he'd been paying attention to UFOs. And he said, Keith talks about these alien abductions from a very different perspective, John. And so what he was describing was how in this talk and in this paper he was about to publish in an anthology, I described the UFO encounter experiences, the alien abductions, as a kind of initiation. I said, wow, there are interesting parallels between the rites of passage that Joseph Campbell talks about. So I said, what if we would just set aside the reality question, which is a big set aside, right? Let's set aside whether they're real or on what levels they're real, and instead look at how they seem to enact a kind of initiatory. These alien abductees, the people who get taken and returned, seem to be going through a rite of passage or an initiation that is like what Campbell describes in initiations in tribal and primal indigenous cultures. So John Mack read this piece and he was sort of fascinated by it. And he said, but what about the reality question? But Keith Thompson just sets aside. So Stan gave him an email or a phone number. John gets in touch with me. He says, we must talk. So we began a series of conversations. He said, I notice you set aside the reality question right off the bat, and you focus on the initiation aspects, which are really interesting to me. But what are these really happening? Are these abductions real? I said, John, I don't know. That's the question. I do know that's the question. On what level, what kind of reality is involved with this? So he
same answer you gave your sixth grade class, by the way. The I don't know, the remaining open to the mystery, which I think is absolutely pivotal. Sorry.
Yeah, John was many years my senior, but I could tell in some ways I was his mentor on this, but it didn't kind of fit that whole framework. We were really peers. We were both asking questions, and he published his first book, sort of taking the abduction phenomenon in the same sense that other researchers did. But he then, in his second book called Passport to the Cosmos, began to ask broader questions about the degree to which we're probably not going to get the secrets of the UFO phenomenon with our prevailing materialist framework intact. We're going to have to ask deeper questions. There's a line from the poet Rilke, who, after going to the museum and looking at the archaic torso of Apollo, which the only thing that existed in that ancient statue was the body of Apollo. The head was missing. And so the question was called the archaic torso of Apollo. And his closing line in that poem was, "There is no place at all that isn't looking at you. You must change your life." So John Mack had begun to say there's a sense in which this phenomenon, whatever it is about, it is calling on something very deep in us to rethink our assumptions about reality. And that's one place John and I really did agree that we're probably not, there can be some aspects of the phenomenon that show up on radar and other elements of physicality that can be chronicled in the materialist framework. But the paranormal dimensions that consistently get evoked, the sense of the synchronicities that the UFO phenomenon involves both psychic and physical experiences in a way that can't really be explained easily by the physicalist model. John was going down that road deeply until his untimely death in an automobile accident in London. And it's been 20 years. So we had some great conversations, and he was working on his third book, which never got completed. But it was a remarkable encounter that I'm always will be grateful for.
Absolutely. And then, like we were talking about with the Laurence Rockefeller initiative, you had made enough of a reputation for yourself in these conversations that you were brought in as part of a gathering at Rockefeller's Ranch, right, where they began to sort of seed the idea of lobbying the Clinton administration for disclosure.
Yeah, I got a phone call one day after I'd written Angels and Aliens. I can still remember picking up the phone. A woman said, "Is this Mr. Keith Thompson?" "Yes." "Would you be willing to talk? Could you make time to talk with Laurence Rockefeller?" And I said, I didn't quite understand what she was asking. I said, well, yes. When does he want to schedule? When would he want to? I knew who he was. I knew he was interested to some extent in the UFO topic. He was a philanthropist with a wide range of interests in spiritual and new paradigms across the board. So she said, well, he's on the phone right now. I said, oh, okay. So he came on, and he had the most magnificent patrician New England accent or dialect. I'll just do a short thing that I remember. He said, "Mr. Thompson, this is Laurence Rockefeller. I have your book, Angels and Aliens, right here in front of me. You take what I call a big picture approach. Is that right?" And I said, well, first of all, please call me Keith. And he said, well, then you call me Laurence, and all the formalities will be settled. He sounded like a combination of Spencer Tracy and Henry Fonda in On Golden Pond, which was reinforced when I finally met him. I said, if by big picture you mean, yeah, I do. I kind of make a lot of connections with UFOs, near-death experience, shamanic encounters. I kind of have a series of concentric circles and Venn diagrams that I don't actually draw, but I think there's a common element between all of these and the broad base of paranormal and visionary phenomena from the mystical tradition. So I said, yeah, in that sense. He said, well, that's the kind of picture I think we need, but I'm interested right now in something a bit more specific. And he went on, I'll drop my Laurence Rockefeller dialect, which I do with great appreciation and warmth. He said he was putting together an initiative to the Clinton administration, which was two years in office. He said the administration is still young. He and Hillary Clinton appear to be very interested in this topic. They've made some inquiries. They're trying to get to the bottom of it, as far as I could tell. So I would like you to join a series of a conference bringing together some of your colleagues, other UFO researchers. So we gathered in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and at a beautiful family ranch, which now belongs to the Park Service. He gave it back to the American people eventually. And we spent 3 or 4 days talking about how to talk with the President of the United States, how to try to persuade the Clinton administration to open to this and to be more open about it. If it wasn't a time to release more of the classified information. There was a dialogue among all of us. Should we ask him to put the entire UFO phenomenon on the table. And I remember at the meeting, which was off the record, not because there was any great sensitivity to what we were saying, but he said, well, Keith, you are the one who's got this big picture. Do you think that we should try to ask the administration to deal with all of these big issues, like the near-death experience? And I just heard him ask it. I said, no, we don't go for the big ontological. And I didn't alone feel that. John Mack was there. He felt the same thing, that the more immediate opportunity was to try to narrow this down into a specific focus. And the decision was made, let's go with Roswell. Let's ask the administration to bring forward more of the facts about Roswell. Long story short, an outreach was made to the president's science advisor, Dr. Gibbons, and he found it quite interesting. He said, I want to pursue this. I had never, he had his own calling. He had his own adventure. He said, I had no idea the phenomenon was anything this serious. So an inquiry was made to the depths of the federal bureaucracy. I can't recall exactly to whom it was placed, but a report came back, a response came back. We have looked, and we have found nothing that challenges the government's argument, the government's case, that it was simply a meteorological balloon. We have no connection with aliens and no crashed flying saucer. Many of Rockefeller's people who were more committed to getting to the facts, were deeply disappointed and even angry. Rockefeller was disappointed as well, but he was a class act. And he thanked them very much. He knew there was more to be told, that we would fight another day. But the outreach to the government, there was a feeling that Bill Clinton probably could have used more of his capital to go into this. But that's always the question. He was a young president who had a lot of things on his agenda, and he probably had people around him, maybe even Hillary, saying, we find this interesting, but this is not the top priority for our administration. If we go down the road of demanding that UFOs, because there was still a very deep, a broad laughter curtain, giggle factor about the UFO thing. And we all understood it. So we felt that some progress had been made. And interestingly, around the aftermath of the Rockefeller Initiative, it was revealed that 5 years of stored records relating to what happened at Roswell suddenly went missing. It was as if they wiped the slates clean up to 2 years prior to Roswell. Anything related to that base, the Roswell base. So that sort of reinforces the idea that there was something they didn't want revealed. I'll just chime in on this. I've looked enough at Roswell to know that it's a real rabbit hole. You can make a case for all kinds of things, including a very solid case can be made for it having been an extraterrestrial craft and dead aliens and so forth. Is also consistent with an alternative explanation that it was some kind of a top secret, either U.S. project or even a Soviet project. It truly is a serious scenario that can be made. What is clear is that the government did go door to door in the town of Roswell, knocking on doors, telling people, if you collected any of the stuff that was out in that field that day, you better surrender it. And it was under threat of serious danger that would come to people. That part has been confirmed. The government had a deep interest. So those who are Roswell enthusiasts who say that there was probably flying saucer, I would say it was consistent with that. It was consistent with something that was way top secret that went too far. So that's the extent of that particular encounter. And Rockefeller was a real yeoman in the way he went at this, and exemplary. And it was an honor to be part of that effort.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that, we're still having these same conversations now. Obviously, David Grush came out and says that we do in fact have saucers, and a lot of that's percolating through. The new NDAA for the upcoming year was introduced, and that has, again, the UAP Disclosure Act language in it that would put together a panel and a disclosure plan, and even have some eminent domain provisions in it, which proved so controversial last time and may have been responsible for it ultimately getting squashed. So we'll see where all that goes, but we're kind of still in that same boat. And part of me is like, when we focus on sometimes these individual sightings or crashes or whatever, and if any of those, when we focus on one, any of those singular incidents can be disproven, or it can be debunked in a way that's thoroughly convincing to a lot of folks. But when we take the big picture approach, which you're still doing in your new book, it's so much more overwhelming, and it makes us look at that evidence in a new light. One of the things that I really appreciated about your book was talking about how sort of there's the physical side of the sightings, and then there's something deeper. It's almost as if the physical sightings are an allegory for something deeper. And you talked about like the universe, every part of the universe is watching us or whatever. It's almost like the universe is trying to communicate something deeper by these shiny physical objects in the sky. And part of the game for us, part of the riddle, is to figure out the meaning there, to figure out what language these sighted objects are speaking, so that we can get at what is truly going on in the universe. Can you talk a little bit about that notion that there's the thing that ordinary people see, but then there's this deeper reflected meaning of it? Yeah.
It's exactly the issue. It's like you could say the entire UFO phenomenon is a text. How do you interpret the text? How do you read
Exactly.
the text? And at some point in my explorations, I said, this phenomenon reads like an allegory. By an allegory, we use the term as an allegory, and we think allegory and allegory and metaphor are pretty much the same. They're not quite the same. An allegory is a form of literature. For example, the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. The opening line of the Metamorphosis is about a character named Gregory Samsa, if I recall. Gregory Samsa woke up one day to find that he had been transformed into a giant insect. That is a heck of an opening line.
Absolutely.
And it develops that during the night, under some circumstances, a human being named Gregor Samsa, had developed, he'd become a big giant beetle. So as Kafka developed this story, it became clear that this was an allegory. The surface level of the story was an allegory for a deeper story, similar to Kafka's famous novel called The Prisoner, in which he described that Joseph K. had one day been arrested, but he had not been told what he was charged with. And so it becomes his effort to understand, well, we are all Joseph K. We are all charged with something. You could say it becomes a metaphor. And likewise, George Orwell's famous Animal Farm. At one level, the surface story reads like a marvelous adventure story about talking animals and how they relate to each other in the barnyard. But it's very clear that as you read it, the mind naturally is drawn to the understory, the subtext. Excuse me. This is a story of political power, of tyranny, of authoritarianism. So the UFO is like that. At the surface at the surface level, the story is about amazing events that are seen in the sky, seen by the senses, registered by sensors of various kinds. We have political and cultural debates. But at the sub level is an inquiry into really what does it mean? What is the nature of reality? What is human nature? I'll give you an example. The synchronicity, the phenomenon of synchronicity that Jung defined, the meaningful alliance between psychic states and physical reality is something that's not supposed to exist. There's Western science defines a firm dividing line between the psychic and the physical. I think of one particular witness, a UFO witness. You can always find one to make the case, but there are many like him. The name was Dennis Sant in the state of New York during the Hudson Valley sightings of the 1980s. He was driving along and he found himself watching an object in the sky that appeared to be something out of what Steven Spielberg did in Close Encounters. It was a classic ship, a spacecraft, a flying saucer. It was luminous and evocative. And he described later how during the 20 minutes that he drove and watched this saucer in the sky, he went through a very deep life inquiry, a deep self-investigation that even as he was going through it, he was moved to ask, why is the seeing of this object in the sky evoking in me a kind of visionary inquiry into the meaning of my life that was very much like, as I read his description, I said, he's describing the same stage in the near-death experience when there's a life review or a reliving of one's life. So again, that line from Rilke, there's no place at all that isn't looking at you. You must change your life. You must, by change your life, Rilke was saying, we are called by each moment in life to ask, what is going on here? We are here. What does it mean to be? What does it mean to exist? That was what Dennis Sant asked that day. So this phenomenon, I know that many in the field of UFO research would prefer that these larger affiliations, the mystical, the religious, would not be part of it. It'd be so much easier if it were just physical phenomena. I'm thinking, I cite in the book the comic actor Charles Grodin back in the 90s wrote a memoir, and he entitled it, "It Would Be So Nice If You Weren't Here." And he was describing all his turndowns in Hollywood when he got turned down. He was a genius with his droll sense of humor, and he got message after message in the early part of his career. Mr. Grodin, it would be so nice if you weren't here. You're not right for this part. It would be so nice if you weren't here. No one ever said that to him directly. And so I often would say that the mainstream of UFO research that has an engineering focus and sees the hardware components that really are real, the material side of this phenomenon is real, they will often seem to be saying, it would be so nice if the paranormal dimensions weren't part of this. Then we could explain it entirely by going to the mechanical engineering or physical engineering department on the university. But just across the quad on that same university are the divisions of religious studies and mythology and folklore. And I have come to the conclusion, actually optimistically, with a sense of ebullience, there's a larger frame for this that includes mythology and folklore. Jacques Vallée, the legendary researcher, was the one who in the late 60s wrote a book called Passport to Magonia. And he said, we need to look for precursors of the modern saucer myth in mythology and folklore. It was immediately assumed, oh, Jacques Vallée is explaining this all away as only mythology and folklore. He wants to take it to the mythology department. That isn't what Vallée was saying. He was saying the events that we're seeing in the saucer frame of reference appear to be real, but to get the larger register, to take the larger temperature of this phenomenon, why would we not look for precursors in myth and folklore and other cultures? For example, in the abductions, in the fairy faith of the Celtic cultures, fairies kidnap children and replace them with crude creatures called changelings. And so the modern researcher says, well, those obviously didn't occur, but the modern abductions are real. Well, really? On what grounds would you say that the ancient precursors are not real? Vallée was saying there's probably something going on that's larger than this, which suggests that there's a larger project in which some form of intelligence is communicating with us symbolically. And that is sort of where I come down as a primary focus in my book. I talk about the celestial and symbolic dimensions of this phenomenon. The something is communicating with us symbolically. And I think it's incumbent upon us to find use multiple ways of knowing, to engage. How do we interrogate this phenomenon?
Absolutely.
Instrumental rationality is one way, asking good rational questions. But I think we need to use other forms of knowing that are available to us.
Yeah, I mean, you spend a great deal of time talking about both negative capability and kind of a radical empiricism, where I think that, talking about all the paranormal things that go along with the sighting, to exclude those because they're inconvenient or they don't fit a physicalist, paradigm, is to exclude the whole important portion, the transformative portion of the story. So to do that means you're not actually dealing with the phenomenon, you're dealing with something that you've created yourself. And so you're not getting any kind of real answers. And so, I appreciate those points in your book. Go ahead.
William James he popularized that term radical empiricism. He had come to the conclusion that all of life is experiential. All of life is experience. Some of the experience feels more like mind than matter. Other experience feels more material or physical than mind, but it's all experience. And so radical empiricism opens to all ranges of phenomena to take an empirical approach. He also had a parallel proviso that he said, in addition to taking a radically empirical approach, considering all kinds of experience as potentially real. At the same time, we need to be mindful of overbelief, the dangers of overbelief. When in approaching the phenomena that we take as radically real, we end up believing more about that phenomena than the phenomena requires. So overbelief means, and the field of UFO research is filled with this, the I
Absolutely.
know what's really going on, the categorical certainty. I'm in the camp that says I'm not as certain. I embrace a kind of Zen approach that not Baker Roshi, but Suzuki Roshi, the Zen master, spoke of as beginner's mind. Not knowing, don't know mind is a good place to land with it. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what's going on. I know that something is going on. That is the place which has allowed me to continue to find this whole quest very satisfying and fertile.
Yeah. And that's allowed me to have all these conversations I have without getting lost in, do I actually believe that something that someone reports actually happened in the physical way that, they describe it, or does it reflect something? You don't have to get lost in those questions. You take people's story and you accept it, and use it to help propel your thinking without getting into the yay or nay questions, which I think is important.
John Mack actually at one point he concluded, he said, this is a phenomenon that appears to come from beyond our world but intersects with our world. And that is not entirely limited to the extraterrestrial idea, but it could be other dimensions, parallel universes. String theory in physics speaks of 11 or 26 additional dimensions. That's an interesting line of thinking.
Yeah.
About could we be looking at phenomena that Jung called them materialized psychisms, the idea that the psychological or internal archetypal realm has a tendency to materialize as form. So rather than matter and mind being diametrically opposite in a dualistic sense, that there's a sense in which the mental realm that is below the surfaces of the lake, let's say, the mountains rise out of a lake. We call that the material realm. But beneath that is this underlying archetypal primordial energy, potency that tends to manifest. So John Mack became very interested in that and wanted to understand that. And he continued to say, can we find a way, instead of trying to shrink this phenomenon down to our narrower categories of this or that, happened, didn't happen, real, unreal, fact, fiction? Can we look at a larger framework in which we expand our categories to meet the richness of the phenomena? That is the place that I come from in this book.
Yeah. Last question. We're at time, and I know you've got another thing coming up, but I wanted to ask you, there has been some talk recently, about the intent or the sort of potential malevolence of the phenomenon. There are folks who are sort of higher profile who have characterized it as being something that may potentially have ill intent toward us. I wonder if, in your experience, have you found there to be any kind of consistent way to read the intention behind what we're encountering with the phenomenon? Or is that, again, what you were just talking about, where we're trying to pigeonhole it into our categories, and we can't because we don't have the big enough perspective to see what the possible motivators might be for another intelligence?
One thing that some of the key researchers on the alien abduction phenomenon, Bud Hopkins, who's no longer alive, and David Jacobs, who's retired from the field, both of them felt this is a hardcore alien presence that is kidnapping people. Bud Hopkins titled one of his book Intruders, and it is absolutely antithetical to human well-being. I am open to that as being possible in terms of some of the beings that people interact with. I'm also open to the possibility, and it seems to me likely, that just as in normal human affairs where I might be defensive, I might defend myself against criticism, I want to defend my autonomy, I want to stand for my own sovereignty. This phenomenon seems to be antithetical to human sovereignty and autonomy. Or is it that is it challenging us to an identity beyond our current sense of sovereignty?
That's where I like to land. That's where I like to,
It's a threat to the ego. It's a threat to think we are. At the same time, there are dangerous people on the street. You walk on the street with care. You find out if you're going through a dark neighborhood, you find out who's behind you. Maybe you make a point not to be in those neighborhoods after dark. So life has difficult dimensions. I would simply say, at the end of the book, the UFO Paradox, I actually asked the question. We now know through understanding of cognitive science that the human cognitive apparatus is about 30,000 years old. That's a long time in terms of one life, but it's a speck of time in terms of the larger picture. Is it reasonable to think that the cause with an apparatus, cognitive apparatus that is just 30,000 years old, that highly privileges rationality, instrumental rationality with binary distinctions such as true or not true, is that necessarily sufficient to grok a phenomenon that could be ancient, that could be several 100,000 or longer years longer than we know? So it may well be, and I kind of celebrate the idea that this phenomenon asks us to take on a kind of broader way of knowing that includes. People ask, why do you bring in the figures from mythology when you talk about the UFO? Why do you bring in Hermes, the Greek trickster? And I wasn't quite sure how to answer that for a long time. It was an intuitive sense. And now I realize that precisely because mythology seems to pertain, according to Joseph Campbell and others, pertain to levels of consciousness that are older and deeper. So to study mythology is not to change the subject away from the sightings, but to place the sightings in a larger framework of metaphor, myth, analogy, similes, even jokes. Maybe we should have at UFO conferences comedians who understand how humor really works in displacing frames of what makes something funny, what makes it memorable. So I know that may seem like a kind of a stretch, but I think we need multiple ways of knowing that are capable of helping this monkey, the human monkey on this planet, this rock of a planet, open to a phenomenon that does seem dangerous. It does seem to question our autonomy, but may be beckoning us to a larger sense of identity.
Absolutely brilliant conversation. Thank you very much. And thank you. And I'd love to have you back at some point. And I hope you write more books. And I enjoyed this hour. So thank you.
I did too very much. I thank you for asking me. I learned what I wrote about when I get to have conversations like this.